Okay, so yes, this is day 2 of the Let's Build a Framework. We are building a combination UI and API testing framework in Node.js, and we're using WebDriver.io as our UI language, and we will be using Supertest, which is an API testing tool for the API. But today we're going to continue with the UI stuff. So as a quick recap, you can always go to github.com. I think it's in the Meetup page itself. We have the West Denver Meetup page. We have everything here. It's set to day 0, so you won't see anything we did last time. I'll talk about how we can get the latest out there, and we'll store them all in branches in GitHub, so you'll have day 1, day 2, day 3, and then if we keep going forward or we do other stuff, we'll make sure to keep updating it with more information. At the top is a README. This has a link that leads to this West Denver software blog, which has very much the same information, but we have you have the recording of day 1, so you can rewatch it or work through it if you're into that kind of thing. And then we have a lot of information about what we actually did. And I have not updated it since day 1. I was in the process of getting married, so I apologize. But I will update everything we did in day 1, keep this all up to date, and I'll stay on top of it for day 2 to cover this all. So I encourage you to follow along if you want to, or follow along at home. I think you can get value out of it either way, and feel free to stop with any questions. But I think we'll start by just kind of going over quickly what we did last time. Last time we spent a lot of time getting set up, and we talked about what a basic WebDriver io.test looks like, something like this. And then we kind of started building out what's going to be our framework. So we started with this concept of page objects as a page. So here's an example of eBay Home. We have it here that takes in a passed-in driver. This is our constructor, and we talked about how we can have functions that open and search for, and we talked about creating our own commands. Rather than using the default WebDriver.io commands, we created our own, and we're storing them in this object called commands, which is here in this lib directory. Right now we just have click and set value. Set value is essentially send keys, so we're going to set stuff to there. And we'll talk about why we're doing this. We did it initially because we created this locator file. So rather than pass locators directly in, we created this JSON file that's going to match up to our pages. So we have each element has the locator here, and we have a description. So the first initial value we got out of our framework was you can see better output, right? You'll get cleaner output. They'll say clicking the search bar at the top of the page, clicking the search button at the top of the page. But we're going to use this a lot more today, and we'll show you some of the real value you can get by externalizing your locators. And we ended off with our first basic test. So here we're using our page objects. We have ebayhome.open, and we call then, this was promises. We talk a lot about promises. We'll talk a lot about them more. And then we say search for orphans. This is still not as clean as we want to, and we'll talk today about how we make it cleaner and better. And then I'm going to go really quick into one thing I did after the day 1. If you'll remember, we had a issue where the tests were running, but it wasn't actually treating them as passing or failing. And that was because we didn't have our commands set up properly. So before, we were just calling driver.click. So our commands right now, we're calling the WebDriver.io command, but we're wrapping it in our own function so we can print out our nice I am clicking this description. And this is going to allow us to do other stuff later on, like maybe retry or wait or other things like that, specific to our desire for our framework. But what I did is, because WebDriver.io uses callbacks and we're trying to write a framework using promises, I wrapped it in a promise. So what happens here is we resolve the result of this click function. So this allows us in our pages to do the same thing. So I can say set value, and then it's now returning a promise, so I can say .then and call click. So the promise works this way. We talked in the first session about it, but JavaScript using callbacks tends to get further and further indented, and it becomes harder and harder to understand. So promises allow you to have this kind of horizontal, straightforward way of writing. And we'll get to the test part, you'll see it becomes easier and easier to understand. And thankfully, once we get further along in the framework, the promises will be tucked up and hidden away, so you won't have to deal with them a lot. But the basic key is if you have a callback thing, you can wrap it in this return new promise, and that will turn your callback into a promise. And if you have something that's returning a promise, you just call .then, and that moves to the next function. All right, so here's our test. And like I said, we want to try and make it better. And I'll give you an idea of what I want it to look like. And we're going to try it. And our goal is readability. Readability is not just nice because for you to read it, it's nice for everybody after you. Especially in test automation, it's not the same as development. You don't initially work with a lot of people. So people can get really caught up in, I'll always understand this, and they don't care about it until the day they have to share it with someone else. And then it becomes very difficult to explain your logic and reasoning behind it. So a lesson up front is trying to make it simple to use and understand will pay off for you in the long run, because you won't have to be answering emails. You won't have to go back and, even if you're the only one writing it, you won't have to look at your own code and seriously wonder what happened. So what we're going to try and do, we're going to try and create something, an object we're going to call on. This fictional object, it doesn't exist yet, is going to be a library that contains all our pages in there. So I can, instead of saying var eBay home equals new eBay home, I can say on eBay home open. And then I can say on eBay home search for orphans. Right? And then we might want to go further, and I can say then eBay home on eBay. We don't have this page yet, but we want to have something like the search results. Click first result. So you can see here, this becomes readable. It becomes somebody who may not know how to code. You can coach them to say, well, just ignore some of this code noise, this function stuff, and just read the words. And you could say, oh, I'm on the home page, I'm opening it, I'm searching for orphans, and I'm clicking the first search result. This is our goal. And then you can see as you build out your page objects, it becomes easier to write tests. And it becomes interesting that you can do stuff because we already have the clean output where it prints out, you know, I'm clicking this element on this page, that you can actually dump all this out to a nice text file or a log file or something. Or if you're really getting fancy, you can pipe it to TestRail or other things like that and have your test code synced with your test case. We're not going to be doing that, but just ideas going forward. So we're going to stick with our initial test right here, and we're going to try and figure out how to do this on eBay Home. And what we're going to call it is, we're going to take a quick sidestep, and let's talk about how you can get back to day one. So if you were participating before and you had pulled it down, you probably have a branch called master. What you want to do if you want to get to where we were at the end of the day or where we're starting today, you would do git checkout day one. And if that doesn't work, do a git fetch, and that will sync you up. So that will pull the latest down, and when you do a git checkout day one, you'll be starting exactly as today. And then for the next one, you'll be able to do git checkout day two, git checkout day three, and then you can switch between them as well. So what I'm going to do here to make sure we don't corrupt anything that we did for day one, I'm going to create a new branch. And if you're not familiar with Git, don't worry. Well, we're only going to use a few basic commands, but this command is basically creating a new branch. So I'm going to create day two. So now everything I do is now in day two. And this will come out when we're done. We'll push it up, and you'll be able to pull it down and look at it. And then if you look at GitHub, you should be able to compare the branches. So if you want to see what was different between day 0 and day 1 and day 2, you should be able to see that as well. All right, so back to what we're doing. We're trying to create this on object. We're going to kind of go backwards. This is one way of programming. Sometimes people like to go bottom up, where I start and then maybe I create the on first and I work my way up to here. I like to switch it up, but this is an interesting way to do it because this way you can conceptualize exactly what you want. So I know I need this. I don't have that defined anywhere. And I know I need the ability to say eBay home and give me that page back. So this is just going to be a very simple collection of pages. So I generally call it the page object scope, but that confuses a lot of people. So we're going to call it the page collection. That's what we're going to call the object, but we're going to give it the name of on. And we're going to say, on is a bit of clever naming because it makes it more English-like. So then I'll say on equals new page object collection. Let me get here. And if you'll notice here, every time we create eBay Home, we have to pass it the driver. This is very important for the test to work. We always have to pass the driver in. Then you'll notice here, I don't pass the driver in. That's because I don't want to have to keep dealing with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to pass the driver in once and have it pass it in whenever we ask for eBay Home. It will say, here's a new one. So I know for sure that I want it on new page object collection. I'm going to, yeah. So basically I'm checking that we've already defined the driver, which we have right here. So I know I'm going to have this new object. It's going to have a driver passed in. And now we're going to move backwards and we're going to say we have to create this object because we don't have it yet. Initially, I'm going to put it with pages. This is a decision. We might want to change it because it's a page collection, so maybe it belongs there. But we might want to put it under lib later on because our pages folder might get very big as we create a lot of page objects. But initially, we're just going to create it here. Page object scope. One thing we do as a naming convention is we tend to put everything lowercase using underscores. The notable exception being locators, and that is because we might want to add a feature later on where a page object automatically loads its locator file by having the same name. But for the most part, we try and stick to lowercase stuff. So the pages and locators are a special exception. But when we give it the name, new classes, we always use what they call, page object collection. Pascal case. Pascal case is capital everything. So it generally follows this, right? Oh, I renamed this page object scope. I should rename it. Old habits die hard. Okay. Page object collection. All right. We want them to kind of line up, right? So lowercase underscore, capital letters. So this is going to be our constructor. We know it's going to take a driver in because we decided that ahead of time. And before, we'll try and stick with the same naming convention we were using, so we'll say passed in driver. The nice thing about programming, if you're new to it, is you can name stuff whatever you want. And don't let anyone tell you have to be simple or whatever. If it makes more sense to say passed in driver, use that. You know, name it something that you know immediately what it is. You're not paying by the keystroke, so you can add as much as you want. Just like before, we want to keep track of our driver. So we want to make sure that we have it. So we'll use this driver equals passed in driver. So what this is doing is saying when someone creates a new page object, they're giving us a driver, we're going to store it here. So this driver now exists in this object as kind of the equivalent of like a private variable. And so that's where we're at right now. This is an object. It has a driver. We want to give it some methods. And we want essentially a method for each page object. So we'll start here. This is how we add a method to a class in JavaScript. Prototype is saying add it to this object. And we're going to give it, what do we call it? eBay Home. Right? So we're saying this has a method called eBay Home. What we want this to be is something that returns us a new eBay homepage or a new page object with that. And we know how to do that from here, right? Got this code right here to create a new eBay home. So I can create a new one. I have the driver. We'll use that same convention we used before. Var self equals this. Again, this is just a good habit to get into. The way JavaScript works is you can easily change scope without realizing it, and what you think when you say this means is actually pointing to something else. So this is just a good habit to get into, is it'll lock us in saying, make sure to keep track of this right now. And so equals a new eBay home. So and we're going to pass in the driver. This is the driver that we got passed in. So every time one of these is created, we get a new driver. Well, it stores the driver, and we can pass that in. So this gives us a new eBay home. So now we can return. So this method creates a new page object, gives it the driver, and passes it back. And it does it every time. This is terribly inefficient, but that doesn't matter. The reason for that I'm not sure what that error means. I'm sure it's going to come back to haunt me. So the idea here is in every new page, we follow the same thing. eBay search results. And again, we're using this, what this is called camel case, with a lowercase first letter and then an uppercase after that. This is just because it makes it for better reading, and there's a certain standards people like to use, so we're just going to follow that. So we'll get on eBay Home, open, on eBay Home, search for. So what that does is every page we have, we can now Oh, you're right. Thank you. All right, well, thumbs today. And the final thing is when you create your new, so we're going to leave this here as a stub because we might come back to it. Stub. You say module.export equals page object collection. And this is how we tell Node that this is an object back. It's not a library. So one thing we have to do is we referenced eBay Home. When programming in Node or JavaScript, you always want to keep an eye because it's not like Java or C# where it's parsing it as you write, and it'll tell you, hey, you're referencing eBay Home. You haven't defined that anywhere. That's up to us. So I always kind of just get in the habit of scanning, and I say, oh, I don't have this here, so we have to require it. So I say eBay Home equals require. And when you're requiring something you wrote, you're always going to pass it in as a path. So path relative to where we are. So we're in the pages directory. So is eBay Home. That's convenient. eBay Home. You don't have to put .js or .json. It understands that innately. I think that's it. So there we have it. Let's see if we can get this to work. So now our function here on eBay Home.open, on eBay Home.search for. A nice thing has happened. Our test no longer is aware of the driver. This is a key feature of frameworks and abstraction, and it's not just necessarily because it's pretty. This also allows you to change it. So at some point in the future you don't want to use Selenium or you don't want to use something else, your code is now less connected to Selenium, right? If I had to change it, I would just have to create a new page object collection that accepts the new thing. So in an ideal world, our test would have no idea what technology we were using. We just want our test to be English-like, and we'll leave the framework for the rest of that. So that's one of the benefits of this that's not necessarily apparent, but becomes apparent sometimes when you have to refactor. So I'm going to turn this test off, and this test. Oh, that's the only one. And let's see if we can run that. So I believe we use Mocha to run it, and I think, where do we store these tests? Test. Where? Oh. So we put it in this My New Framework. Mocha test. Better scripting. Oh, I got it right away. Page object collection is not defined. So if we look at this, a good way to kind of go through it is it'll always give you a stack trace. Sometimes it'll have a lot of garbage. So you want to kind of scan through it and see where it's something that you touched. And I can say, oh, I know we touched that for sure. It's saying line 22. This is the character position, but I rarely focus on that. So let's go to line 22 and see what it's upset about. So it's asking for page object collection, same thing as before. We never defined it. So that's all it's saying is you're talking about something you've never defined. So we want to make sure we put that in. Page object collection equals require. And again, this is something we wrote, so we've got to go up the chain. So now we're under tests. So we want to go up a directory to pages, to page object collection. All right, now if you remember correctly, we had to start the Selenium server last time. So that is also the case this time. So we will do that. We have a batch script for you Windows users to do it. Otherwise, yeah, we have a shell script, start server.sh. You notice I did that in a separate terminal. You can do this in the background if that works better for you. I like it in a separate terminal because I can switch back and you can actually see the command Selenium is processing. One feature a lot of frameworks have is you might want to add something to start the server yourself. We won't go into that this time. I feel it's a small enough step that you can handle that, either starting it yourself or it'll be a fun adventure for yourself later on to try and do it. Now, what just happened there? It finished before we started. And this is a feature of promises and a benefit of Mocha. A lot of times in Mocha, you have to do something like this. You pass something called done. And done says, don't stop running the test until you call this function. Done is something Mocha passes in itself. It can get a pain and it's easy to forget. But Mocha has an innate understanding of promises. But the key with promises, and we talked about this the first day, is you always have to return. So what happens then is it says, oh, I'm done with this function. So it starts executing this, but it won't go any further until this line is done. And this line composes a bunch of commands. So as a result, it won't finish the test until we're done. So I'm typing, we get our nice output. Typing orphans in the search bar. It finishes fast. You don't get to see the result. Oh, sure.
Sorry. So are you scripting the whole entire test in the return?
Yes. Yes. So it's a promise chain, essentially what they call it. The reason I like this over callbacks is we can jump out of our framework at any point in time. So every promise actually returns a result. I could put result here. When you call that resolve function, that's what's happening. And the question was, are we returning the whole test in this one line? So it's essentially a chain of commands. But if I want to jump out and call something else, I can call an API call. I can say if I had an API helper, do something here. And the key is you just always return the promise. And this may seem strange, especially if you're more used to Java or C#, where it executes sequentially, but that's not the case with Node and JavaScript. The second it hits I/O, it stops. Well, it throws it on the stack and tries to move on to the next thing. This is what makes it so fast, but it can make it incredibly frustrating because it doesn't behave the way you think it does. So the whole reason we're using promises is to force it into a sequential nature, and that has some other dividends that'll pay off later. So the downside, as we kind of talked about, is you lose a little bit of readability because you have this constant then in there, but it becomes consistent enough that it's easy to follow what's happening. So the key word with promises is just return. So return this, and each next then is going to have the results of the previous promise. And behind the scenes is keeping it all synced up, and you're still getting a lot of the speed advantages you get from Node.js because promises are optimized. So let's run it again, make sure I didn't break anything. And search for orphans. All right, so that's a little better, right? So we can kind of see the iteration. We started off here. This is straight WebDriver. If you still want to play, you can do a lot with straight WebDriver.io. The issues you get come much later when you have to start maintaining tests. So that's why we're building a framework out. So we're putting a lot of that work in up front. So then our next iteration, we went to here, and so now we're using page objects, so it's a little more readable. We have a little more abstraction. Here, we're getting rid of this new and driver, so we're perpetually trying to clean it up so it makes more sense. So now we can keep going in and creating more page objects, but it's pretty much the same structure we followed before. We're going to do something a little more fun here. We're going to talk about adding a method for all pages, or adding the ability to take advantage of these locator fonts. Okay, the question was, what do promises do to the I/O operation in the stack? It's a bit of a complicated thing, and I'll send out a link. There's a link that goes into a lot more detail on promises, but behind the scenes, the promise executes right away. It just returns. That's why it's called a promise. It returns a, yeah, it's like, I will return you something, but right now it's not ready. And so the whole thing collapses that way. And so the next one says, well, I can't finish until he returns it. And so the promise, as long as the promise is resolved, the whole thing happens. And if it was rejected, you jump out of the stack immediately. All right. So right now we just have a description of a locator. That's not that great. But a real power of having these external locators is we can add any feature we want. A common issue with Selenium is dealing with frames, especially with older applications and stuff with YouTube, as we have a lot of iframes. So we can add the concept of a frame saying, this element exists in a specific frame, and we can give it a name. Unfortunately, eBay isn't using frames, but we can put something like this in. And you can imagine now you can either put a frame in, or if you leave it off, it'll ignore it. And so as a benefit of using our custom command, so now our element has a concept stored within itself of which frame it belongs to. And we can go to our commands, and we can say, instead of calling .click, we can add some logic here. If locator, so this is a common thing in JavaScript. This is a concept called truthy. And basically this means if this value is true, if it's the number 1, or if it exists, it's true. So I'm saying if this exists, do something. If not, do something else. So we're saying if our locator object has a frame, so this one does, this one doesn't, so we want our code to handle both situations. So if it doesn't, we'll just use it as the same one we were using before. No need to do anything more there. But if it does, we want to say, and there's a built-in WebDriver function called frame. And it will take the frame ID. It'll take a number referencing the index of a frame. So you can say the 0th frame is the top. Or it'll take the name of a frame. So most frames follow that convention. They have a name or an ID property. And again, I don't have an example to show you without having to log into Home Advisor, which I don't want broadcast for obvious reasons. But if you see a frame or you go to YouTube, all the videos are always stored in a frame. So, but if we're saying if it has it, so at this point we know it does have a frame value, so I can say switch to the frame value given here, right? So in this case, it'll say try and switch to the frame called test. Or content or something like that. And then once we've done that, then we can call click. And this is an interesting way, again, we talked about wrapping our functions in promises, is you can still use the WebDriver.io chaining methodology as long as they're all contained in this resolve. So it's going to run this whole thing before it resolves. So what does that mean? And we also might want to do something, I think, 0. What this does is it says, all right, I've changed to the frame I want to be in. I've clicked my object. Now take me back out, right? That's an important feature. A big problem people have with testing in frames is when you're inside a frame, you lose track of that, and WebDriver can't see anything outside of the frame it's in. So you'll have a lot of issues where you see the element, the locator matches, everything is perfect, but it's not clicking it or it's not finding it. The number 1 reason for that is you're in a different frame of the locator. So what this does is we switch to our frame, we click it, we switch out. And the real power here, because you may not initially realize, is if you're writing tests, especially the old way, and you're dealing with frames, you have to do this constantly. We'd have to say switch to test, click something, switch back. I think there might also have a method called default content. We'll do a quick Google on that. Switch to default content. Yahoo. What the? Sorry. Do not like Yahoo. So never be afraid to Google. I will Google constantly. I rarely keep track of any knowledge. So I instead I keep track of the concept of knowledge. Like I know there's the ability to switch to frames. I'm not going to memorize how that happens because I know Google has done that for me. So we can see here, it takes the frame ID. I don't see anything about, oh, so here we go. If the frame ID is null, it should switch back to default content. So that gives us our answer. So we would say frame null, or you can just not pass anything. Now, that's fine for that, but this is a whole test, right? If you're constantly switching in and out of frames, your test is cluttered up and dirty. If they change the frame something's in, you've got to go back and fix it everywhere. So instead, we now have it wrapped up here. The concept of the frame belongs with the element, so if they change which frame it's in, I can change here, and our custom commands are handling the switching for us. This doesn't have to be written ever again. When your test goes through, it's going to handle the frame for you every time. And you can expand it. One thing we've run into here at Home Advisor is, especially older applications, they don't just use one frame. They have a whole bunch. So you might have, let's see if we have an example, something like this. This top area might be a frame. This middle section might be a frame. So you might have to go, and they all might be wrapped in some other main frame. So I might have to say, I need to go to main and then a different frame. Now, what I just did is I changed this to an array, with the idea being that I'm going to code it to treat this as a path, right? It's going to say start with main, go to this, go to this. And we could write our test to then say, so we know if we're here, we know we have a frame. And now I can say if this is a JavaScript, this is a custom method, or a built-in method to the array class. So it's going to say, hey, is the frame an array? And now we can say, loop through all frames and go in order. And if not, we can say, just go to the one frame. This is an example of the power of switching it, right? So imagine if we had a fully fledged suite built on this concept of a single frame as main, and then someone says, I need to go to multiple frames. You could change that without affecting any of your tests by just changing this to an array and updating the commands. Because we've had it all isolated, our commands are located to just that. Another feature is, like I said, frames sometimes take indexes. JavaScript is not strongly typed, so I can do stuff like this. I can say string, string, number, and frame will know what to do. It'll say, I'll go to the frame with this name, the frame with this ID. I'll go to the frame that's the index of 1 after that. I won't go through adding the loop through functionality, but you'll just have to trust me that it's not too difficult to do. And even if it was, you only have to do it the one time. So we're going to go back to here. But yeah. So we've already added a feature. Unexpected token, no. There. We've already added a feature to our framework that we can now handle frames uniquely. And we did it relatively quickly. I don't have an example to show you, but it works. So that's an example of making our life simpler. We can make it even more simpler, and we can make it actually clever and do stuff that you have to do in every test. One thing that's very common in writing tests is waiting for something to load, right? Selenium can be very fast, and if your page is very slow, it can, or if your page is very Ajax heavy, right? So the page loads, but there's still JavaScript executing behind the scenes. It won't actually click anything because there's nothing there to click. So you'll get a failure in your test. It'll open and immediately say, I couldn't find the element you asked me to, I closed. So what you end up with is people either put waits in, so they put hard-coded sleeps, or they put a wait for this element until it's loaded. Obviously, the better answer is to wait for given elements, because that's going to be a faster way to do it. But if you're just waiting for a single element, that's not great. What's better is to be able to say, I know that this group of 4 or 5 elements is unique to this page or comprises this page. And I know if these 4 or 5 elements are loaded, I know my page is ready. So what we want to do is have something like this. So I'm going to add a new function to our promise stack on eBay home. wait for page to load. We want a method like this, and we want it to apply to every page that we create. And that's what we're going to build right now. And we're going to build it in a way that, again, makes it easy to do so you don't have to worry about it again. And the best way to do that is think about, well, so we know this locator file, there's one per page. We know that this is going to have all the elements on a page. So we just need a way to say, identify if this element is always going to be there on the page. So we're going to add a concept of groups. This is saying that this element belongs to some group, one or more groups. And we're going to say required for page. So what that means is this element has to be there for the page. Some of them may not, right? Some of them may show up after you click something. Some of them may be there for some user types or other user types. But this will allow us to do this. But we're making it an array. We could just as easily do something like this, required for page, and make it true. We're going to think ahead of, is there any other time that you can imagine where you might want to group elements together? It's not necessarily obvious, but you can think, maybe you have a table of search results. Maybe you have a test that wants to say for each search result it should follow a certain set of rules. So if you make it a group and then you make it an array, you can add whatever you want. You can say search result type element. You can do stuff like IE pain in the butt, use spacebar. So IE has a history of having trouble with clicking, so some elements you have to actually say, if you're using IE, you can't click this, you have to send a keystroke to it, right? You can say stuff like, in French, don't use text. Anything you want. And then all you have to do is write code to handle. You say, hey, is this one of the elements in the group? Then I know how to treat it differently. So that's the reason we're making an array, but we're going to start with the simple concept of required for page. And top search bar and top search button should always be there. So we're adding it to both. So both of these are now in the group required for page. So we need a way to say, conceptually, we want to say, hey, look through every element on this page, and any that have this group, wait for it to load. And if it doesn't load, that page isn't considered loaded, throw an error. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to start in the page itself, but the idea being is that we would put this out into like a base class. And that base class would have this, then all the pages would inherit from it. So every page would just get this for free. I don't know if we're going to have time to get to the base class, but I will put it in a day 2.5 branch or something with some notes on it. But at the very least, we could definitely add it to this page itself. So we're going to add a new method. I'm putting it up here at the top, partially because I feel like this is a more fundamental method. I like to keep the actions on the page grouped together. So this is going to be kind of methods that belong to every page, or internal methods, or an idea like that. But you group your methods however you want. But it's a good idea to try and put them together if they make sense in your mind, how they should fit. So we're going to get a new function, wait for page to load. And I'm going to write out conceptually what I want to do. I want to say, dig through all elements, find any that are in the required for page group. This is a great way to code is commented out, and then a lot of times you can just take your comments and turn them into functions. So and then once I have that, I say for each element, element I found, call wait for element to load. We'll have to look that up. That's probably a built-in WebDriver one. And then we'll say return if successful, reject if we didn't load any. So here we're going to do some actual programming, but we know what we want to do. This is depending on the type of thinker you are, it can be very hard programming because you want to see the whole picture, and it can be very hard to kind of break that down into components. So this is a good way to write it all down, and then we can focus on it one at a time. So like I said, once we do this, we can make a function to do it. So I'm gonna assume we're gonna write a function called find required elements. And this is going to return an array, so I'm going to say so I know I want this function. And so I have two options here. One, I could write this element, I can write this function right now. Or two, if I don't feel like that, if I'm like, that still scares me a little bit, I can say, I know conceptually that I have this in an array. So I can say required elements for each, and I can start going. This is called a for each loop, and it's going to loop through everything in the array. So we're going to have an element here, and I'm going to do something like, make sure to follow my own convention. Self equals this, self.driver. And I don't know what it is, so I've got the handy dandy WebDriver.io function right here. We'll see if I search for wait for. No. Active. So I'm looking for some sort of wait function. I hope they're not going to make us define this ourselves. Maybe they are. Let's go. There's two things in UI automation. There's a concept of visible, and there's a concept of present. So in a web page, there's stuff that's visible, like here, but behind the scenes, sometimes there's frames and divs and stuff that appears or disappears, or stuff that you hover over. Like, see if I can find something that'll show up. Like that. So this is probably still on the page after I go away, or even if I don't go away. But you can see stuff like this. That's in the HTML, but it's not visible. So that's the concept of present. Present means it's in the HTML. Visible means it's in the HTML and you can see it. So anyway, so we found our method. Looks like this. Wait for visible. Takes a selector. Takes MS. MS is standard for milliseconds. Oh, and it's got a reverse. This is a convenient way. So they've given you both functions. So you have wait for element visible and you have wait for element not visible. You just pass in a true or false. So we'll go back to here. Self.driver. Wait for. Oh, dang it, I still got it wrong. What is it called? Wait for visible. So our element in this case is going to be the locator object, right? So we're going to actually want to get the actual locator. And it's a page load, so we'll give 5,000 seconds, or 5,000 milliseconds, so 5 seconds total. Hopefully that's enough. You can adjust this. A good way to adjust this would be to create a config file and then store all these values there, and then you can parse the config file. And we can talk about that a little bit as well. And we don't need to, we can technically pass a true or false, but we don't really need to because it's going to default to true. So that's going to go through each one. This fails. I just happen to know it. This fails if it's not visible, so I don't need to say return false. It's going to throw an error. And so I can return nothing. I can return self, which will return this object back, so if I wanted to change stuff. But we'll leave it like this, so we don't need this last line. But if you're thinking, why are we using the WebDriver method instead of our own, you're thinking correctly. We should use our own because then we have the value of this frame, right? What if one of those elements is in a frame? We need to make sure we're in the right frame before we check if it's visible. So we can do that in a second, but really quick. We still haven't figured out how to find required elements. So this is kind of like in a pinch. You can use the default and test it out, see if it's working, and then say, okay, now I know. You can add a to-do and say, need to make this a custom command. So you're telling yourself, go back and add a method for this. But we still want to, we're hot right now. We know what we're doing. We don't want to get too distracted. So we're going to get back to here. We got our one last thing now. We can find required elements. So if you're one of those people that has a hard time distracting yourself, you've solved this problem on the assumption that you were going to solve this. So we were able to do this logic saying, I don't know how, but I'm going to give myself all the required elements. And then that allows me conceptually to move on. I don't have to focus on that anymore, and now I can go back. So what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called essentially a private function. So var find required elements equals function. We're not adding it as a prototype because we don't want this. We don't want the test to be calling this, right? The test shouldn't be saying required elements. Maybe later we might decide that we do want it. So instead, this is visible to these functions, but it's not visible to the test. So, and this has access to everything that's on this page, including our locators. So what do we want to do? I want to say loop through all the elements and find any that have, we'll start with this, loop through all the elements, and then check if it has the groups, right? So we want to support the concept of groups, but we also don't want to pigeonhole people. Some people might not want groups. There's always a case, some pages may not have groups. So we want to support the case where someone leaves it off, right? They don't want to say not required for page or pass an empty array. So we want to make sure we handle both of those. Check it as the groups field. If so, check if it has required for page. If so, add it to our return array, and then we'll say return when done. Oops. So I have a general idea of what I want to do. When you're doing this, it's good to indent just like you would with code. Yeah. All right, so this tells you inside the loop. So now we can break it down to individual steps. So I want to loop through all the elements. I've got all the elements stored in this locators. So locators for each. This is that same concept. And I'm kind of using elements differently here. In this case, it should be find required locators. And there's no better time to fix your bad naming than when you first notice it. So let's do that. And make sure we change it here. Yeah. So in our convention that we're using, element refers to the actual thing on the page. Locator refers to the thing that tells you how to find the thing on the page. So for each locator, it's going to return this in a locator variable field. So now our next step is check if it has the groups field. How do we do that? Simple as if locator.groups, right? That same convention saying, hey, does it have this field? Yes. If not, do we need to do anything? No. If we don't, we'll just move on to the next one. You could say, if it helps you understand it better, some people like this. But what this means is the same as nothing. So it doesn't fall into this, it just goes on to the other. We're not using promises here because this isn't any I/O. The reason for that is when it loads the locators with require, it's got it all stored in memory. So it no longer has to go out to a file. So we don't have to worry about any asynchronous stuff. It's all going to flow in order. And that's the hardest thing about learning JavaScript is understanding when something is asynchronous and when something is not. And all I can say is that just comes with a little bit of practice. You start to get a feel for, oh yes, this is input-output. It is talking to a file. Or I've already got this. I can treat it as a normal programming language would. All right. So now we know if we have the groups field, next we need to check if that field has required for page. Now we can use the same logic here, right? So we can say locator groups for each function group. And we can do a check here, if group, like that. This is totally valid, but there's a handy dandy trick that you can use, and it's not always apparent. There's not a contains function, which you would expect like most languages have. Usually there's something like this. It doesn't have that. But what it does have is something called index of. And what this does is the same thing as contains, but it returns which element of the array it found. So if it finds it the first, it'll return 0. If it finds it in the second spot in the array, it'll return 2. If it doesn't find it, it will return a -1. So we can use this as a makeshift contains. So if I say, if my groups field has this, so I can say does not equal -1, that's saying it did find it. Or I can say if it equals -1, that means it didn't find it. This is a little hairy. A lot of people like to write their own helper function that essentially becomes contained. You might get some slack or shade from that. Either way is fine, but basically it's a nice trick to be aware of. Same function works for strings. If you ever want to say, if my string index of st, same thing. It's going to check the substring. It'll return the character position of where it found it. Just a trick. I know when I started, I wasn't aware of this, and I was constantly writing multiple loops that did this, and I was getting very frustrated with the language. So we are saying if it does not equal -1. So we want to say if it does have it, what do we want to do? We want to add it to our array. And we don't have an array. So let's fix that problem. Return array. And we're going to make it, that's a way to say an empty array. So we have an empty array. This is where we're going to store our results. To store results, it's super easy. It's just push. And we don't want to push the group because the group is just the word required for page. We want to push the locator. So that's going to give us the right locator. And we don't need to do anything if it's not there. We just essentially don't add it to the array, which we're already doing. And so when we're out of this loop, we return. All right. So conceptually, what happens here is we dig through, we find anything that has this. If not, we don't. If we do find it, we add it to the array. If not, we don't add it to the array. So the nice thing about this is it's going to return an empty array if it doesn't find anything. So it's not going to break anything further down. It's not returning a null or a -1. We're just saying, here's everything we found, and sometimes we found nothing. So we have this. This now pulls in our required elements just like we wanted to. We didn't even have to pass it in. You could put this in a helper function if you want to share it across other things, and you could say that. And this will then take in locators. So you might want to reuse this in other ways, but the way we're using it right now, it's built in to our page. So this should work. And as a result, we can now tag anything with required for page. And that means, as a result, once we pull this out to a base class so that all the pages are sharing it, we can then on any page we want, whenever we want, we can say, right. And that's a very powerful feature you just added. And now anyone after you doesn't have to write it again. Not only do they not have to write it again, all they have to do is add this field. And now, again, you've defined a functional concept of your page in a non-program specific language. If you decide to switch from Selenium, if you decide to switch to Nightwatch, if you decide to switch to Java, this is valid, right? All this information is valid and can move with you wherever you want. It's not trapped in the code. We're almost over time, so I will make sure that's working and send it out. I'll essentially add here our wait for visible command, and it's going to look just like the other one. Nope, it doesn't take any text. And we might even save ourselves a step. Instead of doing a loop, we can also add, it's our commands, we can add whatever we want. We can add wait for group to be. So we might add two methods. This will be handy for other things, right? There might be times where you don't want to have to loop through everything, or sometimes where you want to look for one specifically. But the format's going to be basically the same. I am waiting for this group elements to load. In this case, I might want to say, go through the group and pull out all the descriptions and make it pretty. We'll make that a to-do. The reason I use to-do, most IDEs have a feature that they'll keep track of this, so you can say, hey, I'm bored, what should I do? It's like, well, here's a list of things you told yourself you were going to do later. And then we would do the same idea. And here, I'm just going to put a note here. Write some logic to wait for a group of elements. I'm going to put the same here. This one is going to say I am waiting for this. And it's not to load, to be visible. But a lot of coding is just noise, and sometimes it helps to just get rid of that noise up front, right? I've done everything we did before. I know I have to do this at some point, but I'm just going to fill out everything else around it. It makes it easier to focus on. And sometimes you could stub it out so you can just have it return, right? And so your test can still work, and you can write your test on the assumption that at some point you're going to go back in and write this. But this is what we would do, and then our test would be able to call this, and then we would pull that out in a way that we can add it to every single page. And then we have this handy-dandy function that's for everything. And I'll close it off with the promise of an even more impressive function. The API section, which will be day 3, is not actually that long, so hopefully we'll even get to talk more about this. Then we can talk about other things we might want to do. We talked about adding frames. We talked about adding groups. We can do stuff like this. Alternate locator is a very interesting concept. Developers change locators a lot, right? So you can add that. You can say, you can make this an array and put logic in your function to say, oh, there's multiple, so check for each one, right? So you're making your code more resilient. For locale, you can say, you know, this is for French, or this is for German, this is browser specific. If you're doing mobile testing, it's very common that you have to separate out Android versus iOS locators. But we're going to go to the more interesting one, is we're going to have the concept of a navigation path. Right? This is going to be the idea of how do I get to this page? I want to be able to not only say wait for page to load. You can imagine at some point you're searching for orphan so much it's getting ridiculous. It would be nice if I can just start like this. So it would be magic if I can say return on eBay search results, navigate to page. And this is where we can build this concept into every single page, that the page knows how to get to itself, right? And so now you can teach people, oh, if you don't care how you get there, like if you don't care what you search for and you just need to be on this page, you can call this method. Or you can even make it more fancy where you say, use these values to get to it. And you can do this almost entirely the same way as we did with the locators. We won't get to talk about it, but it'll be a promise of what's to come. Basically, we're going to pass in a way to get there. We're going to say, and then, oh, sorry, navigation path does not belong with the element. It belongs at the page. So we'll give it a special, every page will have a special element called. And that will have the page name, and the page action. And what we are doing here may not seem straightforward, is we are saying, here's a list of pages and functions to call to get to this page, right? Just like our script. It's just a list of pages and functions, right? On this page, do this thing. On this page, do this thing. That's simple enough that you don't need to be code. We can write that in here. And so maybe you have, like we had up above, we might have, you need to search for something to get there, right? Email home, page action, search for something. I forgot what I called the method. And then I can say page value. Right. So this can say, even when it needs specific information, like maybe you need to log in, you can just have a default. And again, the concept is, if you don't care how to get there, you can do that. This opens up a whole world of interesting possibilities because you can jump to a page. And like I said, you can even add special stuff like orphans, or you can maybe make it an array and say, where you can now allow the option, like if they do give me something, I'll use that. If they don't, I'm going to use orphans. So you can then allow methods to cross vast swaths of functionality. And the power of this in the end is you can write a smoke test that goes to every single page and checks that it loaded in one test, right? I can just say, here's a list of pages. On that page, navigate to page. On the page I got to, call wait for page to load. You have a 2-line test that is smoke tests all your page loads all at once. And that will probably be the last thing we cover tomorrow, December. But in the meantime, I will clean up these two and make it out there, and I will put an addendum on day 2.5 that talks about how to make a base class where we put that method in there. But that is it. Feel free to always reach out to me with any questions. I will get everything updated on the GitHub repo and the blog with information we talked about today, and get some more slides and all that good information out there. And I am going to stop this recording as soon as I find it. All right, thank you, everybody. All right. I just need to figure out where I saved it. Are there any questions I can